When we think about what influences elections, our minds typically go to political campaigns, economic conditions, or the popularity of the candidates. But one often overlooked factor that can play a significant role in determining who wins or loses is something we experience every day: the weather. It may sound surprising, but historical data shows that weather conditions, especially on election day, can have a measurable impact on voter turnout and, consequently, the results of an election. But how exactly does weather shape electoral outcomes, and why does it affect some candidates more than others? Let's start with voter turnout. Elections are ultimately decided by who shows up to vote. While many factors contribute to whether or not people cast their ballots, such as political interest, convenience, or voter suppression tactics, the weather is a variable that can either encourage or discourage turnout, particularly in regions where voters need to travel to polling stations. Bad weather, especially heavy rain, snow, or storms, can make it difficult for some people to make it to the polls. Studies have shown that voter turnout tends to decrease by about 1% for every inch of rain that falls on election day, and by about 5% when there is significant snow. In large elections with close margins, this small decrease in turnout can make a huge difference. In the US, where presidential elections are often won by narrow margins in key swing states, the impact of a rainstorm or snowstorm could conceivably sway the result. For example, during the 2000 US presidential election, which came down to a razor-thin margin in Florida, political analysts pointed out that poor weather conditions in certain areas might have contributed to lower turnout in Democratic-leaning regions, which could have tipped the state, and therefore the entire election, in favor of Republican candidate George W. Bush. But why does bad weather disproportionately affect certain groups of voters? One of the key factors is mobility. Bad weather is more likely to deter people who have limited access to transportation, such as those who rely on public transit, which may be delayed or disrupted by heavy rain or snow. These voters are often concentrated in urban areas, which tend to lean more Democratic. On the other hand, wealthier voters who are more likely to own cars and live in suburban or rural areas may find it easier to travel to polling stations, even in bad weather. This creates a situation where Republican-leaning voters may be less affected by adverse weather conditions than Democratic-leaning voters. Beyond transportation issues, weather can also influence voting behavior through psychology. Studies have shown that people's moods are affected by the weather. Sunshine and warm temperatures tend to make people feel more positive, while rainy or cold weather can dampen people's spirits. This can affect voters' motivation to head to the polls, especially in elections where they may feel less passionately about the candidates or issues. In marginal elections, where the decision to vote or stay home can be driven by small psychological nudges, the weather may tip the scales. In addition to lowering overall turnout, bad weather can influence which demographics are more likely to show up at the polls. Research has shown that older voters, who tend to vote more conservatively, are less affected by bad weather than younger voters, who are more likely to vote for progressive or liberal candidates. Younger voters are often less experienced with navigating difficult weather conditions, or they may have more flexible work or social schedules that make it easier for them to skip voting when the weather is unpleasant. This generational gap in turnout during bad weather may skew election results in favor of more conservative candidates. Let's take a closer look at some historical examples of how weather has influenced election outcomes. One of the most famous cases comes from the 1960 U.S. presidential election between John F. Kennedy and Richard Nixon. Kennedy won by a very slim margin, but bad weather in key states like Ohio, Illinois, and New Jersey was thought to have suppressed turnout among Nixon's working-class supporters, who were more likely to stay home due to rain and snowstorms on Election Day. While it's impossible to say for certain whether Nixon would have won had the weather been better, it's clear that poor weather played a role in shaping the turnout, which favored Kennedy. The impact of weather on elections isn't limited to the U.S. either. In the United Kingdom, for instance, bad weather on Election Day can have a similar effect on turnout. Research shows that voter participation tends to be lower when it rains, and that this lower turnout tends to hurt Labor candidates more than their conservative counterparts. Labor voters, who are more concentrated in urban areas and tend to be younger, are less likely to make the effort to vote in bad weather, while conservative voters, who are typically older and more affluent, are more resilient to the elements. The relationship between weather and voting behavior can also have more subtle effects. For example, early voting and absentee ballots, which have become increasingly popular in recent years, may reduce the influence of weather on election day turnout. In the US, early voting options allow people to cast their ballots in the days or weeks leading up to the election, when weather conditions might be more favorable. This has helped mitigate some of the weather-related turnout issues, particularly in states that experience harsh winter conditions during election season. However, in states where early voting is limited, or where same-day voting is the norm, bad weather remains a significant factor. It's also important to note that the influence of weather on elections may become less predictable in the future. Climate change is expected to lead to more frequent and severe weather events, including hurricanes, floods, and heat waves, which could have a direct impact on voter turnout. For instance, if a major hurricane strikes during election season, it could prevent large numbers of voters from casting their ballots, especially in regions that are already prone to low voter turnout. As climate change intensifies, election officials may need to consider new ways of making voting more accessible, such as expanding early voting, promoting mail-in ballots, or improving infrastructure to ensure that polling stations remain open in the face of extreme weather. In conclusion, while we might not often think of weather as a decisive factor in elections, it can have a significant impact on voter turnout and election results. Bad weather disproportionately affects certain groups of voters, particularly those who rely on public transportation or live in urban areas. It can also have psychological effects that deter people from voting, especially when they aren't strongly motivated by the candidates or issues at hand. In close elections, even a slight decrease in turnout due to rain or snow can tip the scales, making the weather an often underestimated player in the outcome of elections.